As many of you already know, visual aesthetics is an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary space for the humanities to rethink media objects, technologies, and the ways in which we interact with the world. Generally, we have 1 hour of presentation, then 1 hour of discussion. So if you have any questions or comments, please hold them off until the end. And for Zoom participants, please enter any questions or comments within the chat. We just want to thank the German Studies Department for co-sponsoring the event, and we're very excited to welcome Bryan Norton. So I think this was the introduce Bryan.
Sure. Yeah, Bryan. Thank you. Bryan Norton is a Mellon Fellow in Humanities at Stanford University and lecturer in the Department of German Studies. He's the editor of a forthcoming volume, Like Entropy and the Future of the Digital with Marx. And is completing a monograph on media and the environment in German Romantic philosophy and poetry, titled Planetary Idealism. Preview of this book, Wallace and Simondon, notes for Romantic Technology is forthcoming from Substance. Other recent writings can be found in Cultural Politics, Philosophical Salon, and the Journal of Visual Culture. So with that, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation as well. And just for organizing generally, thank you, Grace. So I'm going to jump right in with only the preface that this is quite new material that I'm kind of processing at the moment. So there are things and some connections that I kind of allude to, but I really am curious to hear what everyone thinks and just to kind of tease out where some of this material could go in a new form, whether that be a journal article or something longer. So that being said, I'm going to jump right in. Okay, so I want to begin by reading a passage that many of you are probably familiar with. Karl Marx's passage on metabolism and the interaction between humans and the earth in the large-scale industry and agriculture chapter from Capital, Volume 1. Capitalist production collects the population together in great centers and causes the urban population to achieve an ever-growing preponderance. This has 2 results. On the one hand, it concentrates the historical motive force of society. On the other hand, it disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth, i.e., it prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. But by destroying the circumstances surrounding that metabolism, it compels its systemic restoration as a regulative law of social production, and in a form adequate to the full development of the human race. All progress in capitalism. Agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more lasting sources of that fertility. Capitalist production, therefore, only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. Written at the height of the second agricultural revolution in England, this passage presents Marx's critical response to new farming methods, such as the use of chemical fertilizer, that were being increasingly applied to improve productivity in the 19th century. Especially important in this context was the work of the German chemist Justus von Liebig, who first suggested applying the concept of metabolism, Stoffwechsel, to analyze soil chemistry in his treatise on chemistry and its application to agriculture and physiology. The analogy that Liebig draws between the circulation of nutrients within an individual organism and the metabolic exchange between plants and minerals found in the earth forms the basis for what the Marxist philosopher John Bellamy Foster dubs the metabolic rift in Marxist thinking. The metabolic rift designates the material estrangement of human beings within capitalist society from the natural conditions which form the basis of their existence. And the chapter on large-scale industry and agriculture from Capital, Marx is specifically referring to the phenomenon of soil exhaustion, where practices such as over-farming and a heavy reliance on cash crops at the expense of diversity and crop rotation lead to long-term problems with fertility of the soil. Due to the financializing logic of large-scale industrial farms, long-term ecological sustainability is sacrificed for short-term profit. Not only does the metabolic rift lead to problems with the soil, it is also a driving factor for colonizing ventures such as the British monopoly of the nitrogen-rich guano in Peru during the time in the 1856 Guano Islands Act in the US, which led to the colonization of a number of Pacific islands like the Midway Atoll. The metabolic rift draws our attention to an important analogy between the alienation and extraction of value from the worker's body and the alienation and extraction of value from the earth itself. Now, today I want to focus on this colonizing and especially temporal logic outlined by Marx in his depiction of the metabolic rift in Capital. We could say here that labor time and geological time are somehow folded together in a very unexpected fashion. While Marx doesn't follow up on this intimated relationship between labor time and geological time, nor does he ever present what might be called the geological theory of economic value, which would present real problems with his account of value creation and capital, I nevertheless think it is important to revisit and reconsider the connection that Marx is drawing between labor time and geological time, especially as a problem of scale for contemporary politics and culture. As theorists like Apo Horn remind us, it has become increasingly difficult to comprehend or even represent the macroscopic scale of events like climate change, a huge problem both for climatologists, artists, and other intellectuals. The scale of geological time seems quite distant from the mesoscopic scale at which most events perceived by humans unfold. On the other hand, capitalist value creation seems also removed from the macroscopic scale of the climate crisis and the mesoscopic scale of laboring bodies. Value creation has become more and more embedded within the microtemporal processes of digital networks as well. So tech companies mobilize the speeds of computational systems in order to create value in the margins and on the order of nanoseconds. And the smartness mandate, or Halpern and Robert Mitchell identify what they call the demo-based thinking that underwrites these forms of capital. This mandate creates a new form of the metabolic rift between the human body and digital networks, as Shane Denson has recently described in Post-Cinematic Bodies. We might say now that the metabolic rift has become not one, but two. On the one hand, there's a breach between the macro and the mesoscales that Marx identifies, one which has assumed the planetary contours of a changing climate. On the other hand, there's yet another rift between the micro and the mesoscopic, between computational operations and the everyday experiences of sensing subjects. How do we address this now dual nature of the metabolic rift? While there have been some attempts to address this problem, especially among moral philosophers associated with long-termism and those concerned with problems of existential risk, I'm going to take a quite different direction, and I hope that no one's surprised. I'm going to suggest that Quentin Melasou's concept of the arch fossil, when read alongside this new dual nature of the metabolic rift, might provide a valuable tool for addressing these cultural, ecological, and political problems of scale that we are confronted with today, suggesting a mode of material and speculative mediation between macro, meso, and micro scale. The arch fossil helps us think more closely about how to address the mutual imbrication of ecology and technology for contemporary life. In order to understand the importance of thinking the arch fossil as a response to the metabolic rift today, I would suggest that we read Marx once more through the lens of Kant and German idealism. I apologize, I couldn't help myself. The proposal to reorient our understanding of the metabolic rift through the lens of idealism might seem quite counterintuitive. The structuralist political economy outlined in Capital is often seen as qualitatively distinct from Marx's earlier existential commitments which were developed coevally with his critical engagement with idealism in writings like the German Ideology. So while the early Marx emphasizes human agency and the force of revolutionary change, the story goes the later or mature Marx focuses more on macroeconomic processes and the structural determination they have for human history. It also seems that we are now at quite a distance from contemporary conversations about AI and computation. But it is just this tension between structural determination and spontaneity that Marx inherits from German idealism. And it has also been the subject of recent literature on AI. We can find a nearly identical problematic playing out in computational systems, bound as they are by the paradoxical coexistence of the Boolean operations of logic gates, and forms of indeterminacy that appear on our screens when we create an image using Midjourney or interact with an LLM like ChatGPT. Alexander Galloway, in his recent book Uncomputable, Planned Politics in a Long Digital Age, even suggests that to his readers that they return directly to Kant in the face of this tragedy of interactivity for contemporary digital culture. Beatrice Fazzi, in her contingent computation, similarly suggests that the forms of emergence we witness in non-linear systems like neural nets might best be articulated as forms of Bildung, referring to the post-Kantian philosopher and poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Translated as formation and even education, which I find quite fascinating for thinking about the learning of machine learning, the concept of Bildung, explored by Goethe as the ground for organic life, provides the basis for the invention of Bildungsroman, a genre that is born out of the temporal tension between structural determination and self-creation. It also serves as the logical and temporal basis for the automated movement of world history as described by Hegel in the phenomenology of spirit. Now, for Kant, there are two things that are important to keep in mind here. First, there's a structural separation between geology and biology in his thought, a split which is central for his outline of what we might call or think of as a cautiously vitalist epistemology. This epistemology will come to look quite similar to that of prominent early theorists of neural nets, in particular Friedrich Hayek, which I will say a little bit more in a while. The other aspect of Kant to keep in mind is his rejection of the thing in itself, the Ding an sich, while trying to articulate this relationship between mind and world. So let's start with the ontological separation of geology and biology. This separation begins to appear already at the middle of the 18th century. In 1755, when Kant was 31 years old, Europe experienced one of the greatest natural disasters since the bubonic plague, which wiped out nearly half the population in the 14th century. On November 1st, an enormous earthquake rocked the capital of Portugal, killing an estimated 12,000 people. Not only did this lead to an increased interest in geology and seismology among intellectuals in Europe, it also raised a number of important questions concerning the theodicy principle that was embraced by thinkers such as Leibniz and Alexander Pope. How do we square belief in divine providence with the devastating reality of such natural catastrophe? Around the time of the Lisbon quake, Kant wrote a couple of texts that are important to note here. The first was on natural history, universal natural history and theory of the heavens, or essay on the Constitution and the mechanical origin of the whole universe according to Newtonian principles. Written just prior to the Lisbon earthquake, this essay embraces a naturalized version of Newtonian physics, one which is cleansed of metaphysical implications about good, evil, or cosmological purposes in nature. The separation of natural history and Newtonian science from metaphysical concerns about good or evil was central for Kant's subsequent attempts to naturalize events like the Lisbon earthquake, which he would go on to do in essays like, quote, on the causes of the earthquake on the occasion of the disaster which affected the Western countries of Europe towards the end of last year, and quote, history and description of the nature of the most remarkable events of the earthquake, which shook a large part of the earth at the end of the year 1755. So in brief, for Kant, metaphysical concerns must remain separate from attempts to understand the earth. What about the life sciences? Could biology be explained using only Newtonian principles of attraction and repulsion? This was, of course, the central problem for 18th century systems of knowledge. Were organisms just machines, as Descartes believed? Could the human subject be understood as one such machine, as the physician and philosopher Julien Offray de la Mettrie set out to prove in his Man as Machine? Not only were such questions fundamental for developments in 18th century medicine and theology, they were also central to the development of systems of classification. Particularly important were mid-century debates between Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, and Georges Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon, the father of natural history. In his Systema Naturae from 1735, Linnaeus proposes organizing nature into three kingdoms: plant, animal, and mineral. These kingdoms are then further divided into order, genus, and finally species. Buffon, for his part, casts doubt on the neatness of this system. So here we have all these paradoxa, and there are, these like really strange attempts to try and to fit the natural world into the system. How can we draw analogies also between plant, mineral, and animal kingdom? Asked Buffon. Surely we can't talk about the speciation of minerals in the way we talk about the speciation of plants. Buffon, for his part, suggests that we focus more on the issue of reproduction as the grounds for biological speciation. These debates become especially important after the invention of the microscope and the discovery of new organisms like the hydra, which first observed by Antony von Leeuwenhoek, who published his findings in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and then again 4 decades later by Abraham Tremblay, whose memoirs Pour servir à l'histoire d'un genre de polype douce would be translated into German in 1775. So long story short, the hydra seemed to defy all categories of classification. It was a tiny freshwater predator that can reproduce both asexually and sexually. It doesn't appear to die of old age, and it has this uncanny ability to regenerate parts of its body that were severed, hence the name hydra. So for Kant, and here's the hydra tops the list of the paradoxa for Linnaeus, you can see. So for Kant, problems regarding the classification of nature in general suggest a much deeper existential crisis for these 18th century systems of knowledge. Systems of classification like the one proposed by Linnaeus seem to break down not because of poor data or poor observation or a lack of data. They fail due to bad metaphysics. In his critical trilogy, beginning with Critique of Pure Reason, Kant suggests returning to some basic philosophical questions concerning the origins of knowledge. Where do our ideas come from? How do they connect to the world as we sense it? And how does this provide more stable support for these increasingly popular systems of classification? Kant famously suggests that there are 2 rather than 1 sources of knowledge. Understanding without sensibility is empty, and sensibility without understanding is blind. By doing this, Kant breaks from and combines the 2 prevailing trends of his time, rationalism and empiricism. Alongside rationalists, Kant suggests that the most stable parts of cognition are not those provided by experience. This rejection of experiential immediacy leads Kant to famously claim that we have no access to things in themselves. On the other hand, however, and this is where Kant gets a bit more complicated, unmediated self-knowledge is equally impossible. We cannot say anything meaningful about the mind without in some way referring back to sense experience. But if there are no things in themselves out there in the world, what causes sensation? That is sort of the problem for Kant. Cognition at its core combines both sense and intellect in an act that Kant famously names a priori synthetic judgments. These are judgments which which relate experience to conceptual activity and then back again. So this establishes an ongoing feedback loop between our concepts and our sense experience. The main task of philosophy for Kant is not to create an accurate picture of the world. Instead, philosophy's task is to create an effective sorting algorithm that can mediate between these 2 domains. Which parts of cognition belong to sensing and which parts belong to the intellect? And how do we combine these in an effective manner? So this set of concerns leads Kant to propose a sort of second-order sorting operation, the table of categories. Cognition for Kant is a process of the ongoing projection of the subject onto the world. If we abstract from all content of a judgment in general and attend only to the mere form of the understanding, we find that the function of thinking can be brought under 4 titles, each of which contains under itself 3 moments. They can suitably be represented in the following table. These functions that my mind projects onto my experience are then translated by Kant into his famous table of categories. So what is the table of categories? What does the table of categories mean for claims we might make about the natural world? Quite a lot, in fact. We see, for example, how metaphysical questions of purposiveness or morality have been removed from judgments we might make about our sense experience. In addition, the mode of causality here, under relation, becomes an intellectual function of cognition. Causality is removed from the world and becomes a function of the intellect. Newtonian attraction and repulsion become then contingent ways of perceiving. There are no things in themselves that could prove otherwise. What happens here to the seemingly purposive activity of organisms? Here is again where Kant gets kind of interesting. In the third critique, the critique of judgment, Kant returns to the question of causality, and even the topic of purposiveness in his discussion of biology as he relates it to human freedom, which for Kant means the ability to be a cause and for oneself. Yet we are right to bring teleological judging into our investigation of nature, at least problematically, but only if we do this so as to bring nature under principles of observation and investigation by analogy with the causality in terms of purposes, without presuming to explain it in terms of that causality. Hence, teleological judging is reflective, not determinative. The concept of connections and natural forms in terms of purposes does at least serve us one more principle for bringing nature's appearances under rules in those cases. So what's at stake here is the purposiveness of organic life. This is where the rejection of the thing in itself comes in handy for Kant's nature philosophy. We must admit as humans that we somehow recognize ourselves in nature when we observe organic life's ability to determine its forms spontaneously. This is, of course, not without some form of material constraints. But since we cannot know things, in this case organisms, in themselves, we must also acknowledge that these judgments cannot be definitively proven. The analogy between organic life and freedom corresponds only to the way the mind sees, hears, and perceives. Does the same apply to geological forms? For Kant, this is a tricky question. Writing about geological forms, especially crystallization, Kant sort of nods in this direction when he talks about the ability of nature to individuate purposively. He makes a distinction between the mere aggregates and functional systems like organisms, which exhibit reciprocal relations between part and whole. And here's again where the category of relation becomes so central to how Kant is sort of articulating this, slowly articulating this distinction between biology and geology. Insofar as nature's products are aggregates, nature proceeds mechanically as mere nature, but insofar as its products are systems, e.g. crystal formations, various shapes of flowers, or the inner structures of plants and animals, nature proceeds technically, i.e. it also proceeds as art. The distinction between these two ways of judging natural beings is made merely by reflective judgment. So the analogy between geology and biology, however, only goes so far. Kant eventually suggests a hard break between geology and human reason, based off of the inability of the mineral world to reproduce itself in the way that organisms do. Geology is finally held at bay. We got past the Kant, so I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay, so how does this help us think about the metabolic grid? Marxist critics like Terry Eagleton have, of course, noted similarities between Kant's presentation of the thing in itself and the commodification of material culture. So exchangeable forms of appearance seem to be prized over any substantial content of the world outside of the mind. More importantly, however, since there can be no access to things in themselves, there is no real relationship that is possible between sense experience and geological process. Geology literally falls outside of time for Kant, just as it falls outside the scope of financial capital in the metabolic grid for Marx. The eventual rejection of an analogy between the process of crystallization and organic formation means the rejection of the earth as a necessary substrate for lived experience. There is an epistemological rupture between geology and life for Kant that presents an ontological prelude to the metabolic grid. But do geological concerns like climate change force us to return to metaphysical questions about good or evil or divine purposiveness in nature? So what's the alternative? I think it is important to note that Kant's rejection of the thing in itself and this sort of hesitant embrace of an organic philosophy of nature serves as a sort of backdrop for later phenomenological theories of perception, many of which will become central to the later development and theorization of AI. So I don't think we necessarily have to go back to metaphysics, but we should look forward to sort of what comes after and who's drawing on, and who's really drawing on this discourse. The history of post-Kantian theories of perception in this way, I think, are really important for appreciating the dual nature of the metabolic rift. So not just geology, but also thinking about metabolism in terms of computation in the microtemp world. So in works like the 1886 analysis of sensation, Ernst Mach, for example, draws on Marx in order to suggest that perception, rather than passively receiving impressions of the world, is actively involved in shaping experience. Purposiveness of nature, Mach writes, is thus found in the creation of concepts. Mach's work on perception had an enormous impact on the neoliberal economist Friedrich Hayek, and particularly the sensory order, where Hayek draws analogies between sensory perception and the market economy. And this sometimes overlooked phenomenological treatise, Hayek argues for a foundational analogy between cognition biology and the free market, one that is inspired directly by early research on neural nets. In particular, the development of the perceptron by Frank Rosenblatt is important here. Hayek describes a world in which, quote, the qualities which we attribute to the experience objects are, strictly speaking, not properties of objects at all, but a set of relations by which our nervous system classifies them. What the apparatus of classification provides, in Hayek's words, is more a sort of inventory of the kinds of things of which the world is built up, a theory of how the world works, rather than a picture of it. Cognition, as it is understood by Hayek, is about recognizing patterns. It is operational and not representational. The market and neural nets are analogous forms of distributed pattern recognizing intelligence. An identical understanding of cognition had, of course, guided earlier research on computation as well. We can think of the premise of Turing's seminal paper on computational machinery and intelligence. And here it's about the classification of the sexes. But for Hayek, though, I think it's important to note that we're not dealing with linear systems like that of Turing's earlier computer. Markets and neural nets, like organisms, likewise, can only survive through recursive interactions and more complex non-linear relations. The problem which the existence of mental phenomena raises is therefore how, in a part of the physical order, namely an organism, a subsystem can be formed which in some sense, yet to be more fully defined, may be said to reflect some features of the physical world as a whole, and which thereby enables the organism, which contains such a particular reproduction of the environment, order to behave appropriately towards its surroundings. In his preface to the sensory order, Hayek attributes this line of thinking to Mach's theory of perception and also to Kant's rejection of the thing in itself. I still vividly remember how, in reading Mach, in an experience very similar to that which Mach describes with reference to Kant's concept of the Ding an sich, I suddenly realized how a consistent development of Mach's analysis of perceptual organization made his own concept of sensory elements superfluous, an idle construction in conflict with most of his acute psychological analysis. We're taking a deep dive here into like Gestalt perception conversations. But the main point that I'm trying to get across is like Friedrich Hayek is like ought to be into Kant here in sort of this tradition through early neo-Kantian movements and especially Ernst Mach's material monism. Where was I? Yeah, anyway, so Hayek's is a world in which no organism, economic actor, or network has access to the information. So the world is bereft of any higher purpose beyond the organism or the desires of Homo economicus. So here it kind of resembles this Kantian world in and even a more sort of empty way in terms of some sort of transcendental content. Yet the perceptual field described by Hayek, which is again cognitive, biological, and economic all at once, is capable of self-correcting. So there is some sort of inner logic here. So how do we describe this inner logic or build up a science capable of predicting events, as Hayek claims he aims to do? Now, interestingly enough, Hayek essentially sneaks technocracy into the back door, arguing that some form of reflexive knowledge is actually possible, especially in the market economy. Such knowledge, however, is only available to a certain group of people, experts, engineers, economists. And the role of the state is to effectively calibrate and train the market's algorithm to make it run more and more smoothly. So again, we have this issue of the politics of education and Bildung, and there's this strange pedagogy that's happening between markets, the state, and experts. Any problems or social ills that arise in the process are just due to either poor calibration or especially state intervention. The only alternative to this model for Hayek would mean a loss of freedom. So this presents a picture of the world that is both fully naturalized and fully automated. Yet autonomy is irreconcilable with anything else. In a recent book, The Eye of the Master, Matteo Pasquinelli urges us to think carefully about this link that is emerging between autonomy, literally making one's own law, self-governance, and automation moving on one's own when we look at the material history of artificial intelligence. Reading the history of neural nets through the lens of Kant's struggle to articulate a meaningful distinction between organism and mechanism, I think we can see how blurred the lines become between the self-development of biological organisms and the extractive activity of a capitalist economy. As Marx writes in the Grundwisse, it is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker. It is itself the virtuoso with a soul of its own in the mechanical laws acting through it. It consumes coal, etc., just as the worker consumes food to keep up its perpetual motion. The worker's activity, reduced to a mere abstraction of activity, is determined and regulated on all sides by the movement of the machinery, and not the opposite. The science which compels the inanimate limbs of the machinery by their construction to act purposefully as an automaton does not exist in the worker's consciousness, but rather acts upon him through the machine as an alien power, as the power of the machine itself. Understanding this alien power attributed to the machine is central to appreciating the dual nature of the metabolic rift, when the extractive logic of the rift itself has become more and more automated. While worries about the so-called loss of control of our civilization due to the development of AI systems have grown extremely loud over the last years, most responses from the tech industry paradoxically presented AI as both the problem and the solution, while passing over more pressing social ills or threats like climate change. As Hannes Bajor has explained in a recent article, the X risk is the primary concern of long-termists, a libertarian, transhumanist, and ultra-utilitarian school of thought that gives possible future humans an incomparably greater weight than actual present ones. They actually have weird charts about population growth. It's wild. Its proponents, to whom Musk too feels a close affinity in millennia, and in terms of narrow utility maximization. For this reason, the threat of a hyper-intelligent machine worries them much more than, for example, the immediate damage caused by climate change, social justice, or poverty, problems that, to them, are either non-issues or will be resolved through the very AI they perceive as existential threat. And again, I think it's really interesting and important that it's this sort of everyday mesoscopic scale between the micro and the macro that is being left out of the conversation here. And I think Bajor is doing a really good job of articulating that. So if this won't help us start mediating between the macro, the meso, and the micro, where do we look for an alternative? A better way to achieve this type of mediation, I think, would be to repurpose the concept of the metabolic rift in order to account for the additional rupture of relations between the microscopic, the scale at which computation operates, and the mesoscopic scale at which human modes of sensing occur. Such a repurposing, of course, has been pursued to great effect by media theorists and historians, such as Shannon Mattern and Shane Denson in particular, whose work on embodiment and post-cinematic media have attended to the overlooked metabolic realities of our interactions with digital technology. Now, in order to connect these conversations back to the scale of the macroscopic, I would like to experiment for the remainder of my talk with placing this dual metabolic rift alongside the concept of the arch fossil, proposed by the philosopher Quentin Meillassoux in his 2008 treatise After Finitude. The arch fossil refers to not just materials indicating the traces of past life, according to the familiar sense of the term fossil, but materials indicating the existence of an ancestral reality or event, one that is anterior to terrestrial life. An arch fossil thus designates the material support on the basis of which the experiments that yield estimates of ancestral phenomena proceed. For example, an isotope whose rate of radioactive decay we know, or the luminous emission of a star that informs us as to the date of its formation. So we've been generally too focused on epistemology and philosophy and metaphysics since Kant made us who is suggesting. In focusing on the discursive constructedness of the terms we use to understand the world, we lose sight of the materiality upon which the discursive rests. This lost sense of objectness and materiality corresponds equally to the geological substrate upon which life on Earth depends. It sheds new light on the materiality of the digital as well. We are dealing not just with logic gates and microchips, but silicon and copper, cobalt and lithium. An arch fossil, this designates the material support on the basis of which the experiments that yield estimates of an ancestral phenomena proceed. To conclude, I want to look at some recent artwork that investigates this relationship between geology and computation that the arch fossil seems to speak to. The first is a long-term conceptual project begun in 2012 by the Austrian sculptor Martin Kunze called Memory of Mankind. Yeah, it's weird, you'll see. According to his description of the project, Kunze began Memory of Mankind after reading the 2013 New York Times bestseller, The World Without Us, in which journalist Alan Weissman explores how the surface of the planet would change over time after an unnamed extinction event wipes out the human species. In Memory of Mankind, Kunze proposes creating and storing artifacts in the world's deepest salt mine in Hallstatt, Austria, in order that human beings will be remembered in perpetuity. Funded by organizations like Heritage Futures and The Long Now, a nonprofit created by Stuart Brand, Memory of Mankind proposes to, quote, preserve the 1,000 most important books of humanity. That's what they came up with. So we can argue whose stories are being told. The most durable data carriers in the form of ceramic tablets. So there's this idea that ceramic is it just has such a long lifespan as a sort of over and against the digital. So he's creating these sort of microfilm ceramic tablets that he's hiding in the salt mine. It's wild. Anyway, stored in the oldest salt mine in the world will carry our stories hundreds of thousands of years into the future. A diagram published on their website gives us an idea of the basic types of content that Kunze and other participants are collecting. There's an institutional archive, an accumulation mechanism, which I guess means some kind of scraper in a database, because here's just daily editorials of the big newspapers of every country, and blogs. So if you have a blog, get on that. And personal content that people provide. So we see this kind of connection to conversations about existential risk. The future of nuclear waste is mentioned here in institutional contents. So the project, while conceptually interesting, I think is still a bit too long-term for me. And it's really unclear how this all folds back into the mesoscopic and sort of sense experience today. Although, to be fair, there's a problem with the funicular right now, so I haven't had a chance to visit the site. But I'm going to visit. I think we see a slightly different logic of the arch fossil, though, play out in some recent work by the Swiss sculptor and conceptual artist Julien Chapier, who many of you might be familiar with from his solo exhibit last year at the SF MoMA, Towards No Earthly Pole. In his installation work, Chapier draws on the geological focus of the land art movement, citing feminist art historian Lucy Lippert as a major inspiration. So in her book Overlay, Lippert explores the connections between contemporary trends such as monumental art and materials found at prehistoric sites by archaeologists around the globe. Drawing on these trends, Chapier poses critical questions about technological media, geological time, and things like photography and chemistry, crafting the logic of the arch fossil into unexpected non-anthropogenic forms. In this video installation Towards No Earthly Pole, we see glaciers in the Arctic lit by a single beacon, a process of illumination Chapier likens to developing photographs in a darkroom. And much of his work also has an emphasis on handcrafted labor over and against high theoretical speculation about AI, or the digital. Nevertheless, his choice of material never ceases to call our attention to the geological and mineralogical basis of computational architecture. In his salt sculpture pieces, Future Fossil Spaces, he uses salt from the world's largest salt flat, the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, in order to, quote, highlight the tension between a material of the future, lithium, and the time which has had to elapse in order to create it. Future Fossil Spaces is part of a global reflection on the digital era and the materials which allow for the advent of a period of ever-increasing dematerialization. Utilizing salt and its resulting lithium brine from the world's largest salt flat, the artist has created an installation of towering salt brick columns in lithium vats, which oscillate between topography and landscape. The title similarly refers to future negative spaces that will be carved out in the earth by mining operations, traces of how the digital era will mar the physical world which sustains it, effectively demonstrating how the enlargement of the virtual world requires a hollowing out of the world of natural resources. In works like Shahier's, we see a serious engagement with the problems of scales that arises as soon as we try to think ecology and technology together for contemporary politics. The staging of a confrontation between the microtemporal operations of digital networks and the macrotemporal timescales of geological processes nevertheless calls our attention as well to the ongoing importance of the mesoscopic scale of human sensing, through which a new sense of political urgency for art may arise. The arch fossil is found when we literally get to the bottom of the dual metabolic rift. Thank you.
Oh, that was really fun.
Yeah,
that was really exciting. I mean, I have questions, but I'm sure you have a lot of people, so I'm sure everyone else has questions. So I'll just open the room to questions. And if you want to get yourself some pizza or wine or something, feel free to float in the table. But yeah, any questions first?
I'm gonna get myself some wine.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, is this from the Zoom?
Yeah,
Oh, amazing.
let's do it.
If the Zoom person could please introduce themselves very quickly, because we can't see quite who it is. And then if you want to stop your screen.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that.
Yeah, so we can see everything. Let me-
Cool.
Yeah.
It's a very immediate question.
Yeah. The Zoom person also feels shy on this, and we also can read aloud your questions. Anybody on Zoom, we can read aloud any of your questions if you decide to check them. So.
What's that?
I think it was Marx.
Okay.
Wasn't
Merrick, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. So I appreciate the talk very much, and I'm curious what you might say about the arche fossil, Brian, in relation to, say, if we were to designate T1 as the point of the beginning of your talk.
Okay.
And the image of the galaxy that we're currently in. Like what, maybe the question isn't that sophisticated or great, but if at the beginning of your talk we could consider as like time point 1 and the image of the galaxy at that point is at a certain type of light years away from now, let's say a couple billion light years away, like what might we say about this idea of the arche fossil? Is the very beginning of your talk part of a sort of archae fossil itself, a sort of trace of ancestrality, rather than digging into the geological and rocks and minerals and earth to find bones and things that are well before human time, etc. Could we not say that the archae fossil could apply to human temporality itself, according to astrophysics?
I have a follow-up question,
Yes.
and I think it'd be nice if you could also like delineate like the differences or perhaps similarities and resonances between archaeology, paleontology maybe, and the archive, because I think all these things are related to this idea of trace, preservation, and scale.
Okay, so I have archaeology, paleontology, archive, and astrophysics. Okay, let's do it.
Can we toss biogeochemistry?
Biogeochemistry, great, noted. Okay, so in terms of thinking about scales and in terms of thinking some sort of what I might consider a sort of cosmology that also has political importance that we can sort of make sense of more immediately. I think so. The best image that I've found of this, and I think it's also just a beautiful illustration of the art of Melissu's concept, is Patricio Guzman's Nostalgia for the Light, where he makes this documentary about women after the dictatorship searching for the scattered bones of their loved ones. And he takes them at the end of the film to the satellite array. And there's this beautiful connection made between, sort of stardust, looking into space, that is actually very cathartic for these women, because there's some sort of like a reconnection to some sort of pull that is also a part of this process of overcoming a sort of very down to earth political trauma. And that for me is like why this has political teeth. And I think that was also a moment where I saw that film and then saw it again, and then thought about Melissu some like a year later, when going back to that scene, where I sort of realized that there can be these sorts of connections, and also, but you can't have them without thinking about also forms of mediation. And I think that's where Melissu sort of allows you to do both. There's no astrophysics without today, without like no one's like wandering around staring into space and falling into wells, like being laughed at by like Trajan women any longer. That's not how we do astrophysics. So in terms of, and I think that also connects, there also is that activity of digging that these, now I kind of wanted to have, maybe I should have just given a talk about Guzman's film, but I think that also speaks a little bit to this idea of digging under, like sort of digging into the earth as well. I'm really just kind of floating associations more than anything, I think. In terms of the archive, biogeochemistry, I'm definitely going to have to think about these a little bit more, but could you say a little bit more about, I'm especially interested in the archive direction that you were asking about. But does that help at all? Is that kind of what you were looking for, Merrick? Okay,
that's nice. I just think that I think your response gets us back into part of Melissu's original critique in After Finitude, which is getting us back into the correlationist circle, where observer and observed is basically a sort of circle that's reducible to contingency, as opposed to his argument developed in that work to go beyond to speculate, etc. But at the end of the day, I'm not really sure. I haven't seen the images that you're referencing here, so.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely something for me to sit on, I think.
Could I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
This person who's done this.
what's that?
I said the person who's done this.
Oh, no, I'm still trying to figure out the role of the arcade fossil. I guess, I mean, I think it does speak to this question of like the double metabolic drift that you're pointing to. And I think that that's like really illuminating to delineate like a duality there. What I'm struggling with though is Meyasu in general, maybe. I mean, honestly, that book kind of inspired me to think of discorrelation as a fact. So, I mean, that one new metabolic rift that you're pointing to, it comes out of an engagement with that. But the thing that has always troubled me about that book is, well, I mean, there's many things, but one of them is that it starts, and I think, and it's been like 10 years since I've read it, but I think that the idea of the arcade fossil is predicated precisely on this opening gesture of questioning or reinstating the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, right? Which is the distinction, which is at the center of Berkeley, Hume, and Kant's critique of this tradition, where primary qualities are like the durability and whatever you feel it, whereas secondary qualities are vision and smell and things like that. But I mean, Hume and Berkeley and Kant all argue that, well, how are you going to know this durability without the mediation of your senses, right? And so this distinction collapses. So I guess what I'm questioning is how Meyasu and the arcade fossil opens up what you've said, the space of mediation, the role of mediation in this equation of getting over or coming to terms with this dual metabolic drift. It's not so much a critique, and it's definitely not a critique of what you're doing. I'm just trying to figure out how the arcade fossil helps us get back to the mesoscale. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I should also preface this by saying I am totally fine if Meyasu would have hated what I have to say. That's fine.
Right. But maybe then there's a critique in there of Meyasu.
Yeah. I mean, I think for my purposes here today, I was really interested in, I mean, for one, it presents some alternative, or at least like some alternative that, or like some basis for thinking about the macro that like really for me was, I think, the main question I was asking when I started writing this, and then how it all sort of loops back to sensing, I think, are some of the next steps that I will take. And I think that I definitely see a world in which that takes me beyond Meyasu, or sort of activates him in a very, very particular way. Is that, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, I think there's, I mean, it is compelling though, this idea of the fossil, right? It's just the arcade fossil. It's like, I don't know. But I think this is something, I think you're right, that there's something there, and maybe the confrontation of Meyasu with mediation, like in the film you were describing, maybe that's the way beyond Meyasu too.
Yeah, there's a sort of a way in which through observation we actually get out to the other side, in terms of thinking about, I don't know, like Stardust in that case.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess just following up on the whole archive question, I was thinking about that primarily when you were looking through the mom piece.
Has anyone ever heard of this? I'm like so obsessed with this right now. It's wild. Anyway.
Yeah, but it's really a question of like, then what is it really? Is it like an archival impulse that's like putting everything together? Is it like, but it also intends to be sort of like thing that will be done with eventually, like an archaeological artifact of sorts. I think the distinction between paleontology and archaeology also comes up with the idea of the archaefossil. And so like what exactly, I think these delineations, I don't know, I haven't read Meyasu. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear what you might think about all these things.
Can I pose a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
Because the counter, or I guess, I don't know how we can think of the law.
Yeah.
Freud. That what was it, under Carl Sagan, where they sent that capsule
Mhm.
into space in anticipation that if any sort of other being would see sort of an embodiment of what humanity was and be captured in whatever this capsule was. So it kind of reminded me of that in a, I guess, thing of Stardust. I don't know, sort of how that figures in.
Yeah. So if you, I think to compare and contrast the two, if maybe that's sort of what you're,
Or maybe not.
or so I think there's something like the gesture of sending a capsule into space isn't like, well, we're done here, so like let's start like making sure that whoever like whatever beings come here next are going to be able to read their Homer. Like I think that's a much different gesture than or making sure we have like everyone's blog in a salt mine. Like where apparently like my everyone's blog will probably be read just as much. Yeah, like to me that's just like a different gesture, and it's also thinking about life in a sort of imaginable time scale to today as we relate it to cultural issues and sort of like political issues, ecological issues that like feel more pressing today. Like it doesn't erase that, I think. So that's more I think that is where I would say that that's like, yeah, sure, it is a sort of like time capsule, but it's a time capsule that's created for a very particular reason in a really weird way. Yeah. Maybe I should have just given my talk about Paul. That would have been amazing. Yeah.
Can you say more about what you see as that reason
What reason?
for mom?
Oh, I mean, I see it as just like a kind of, yeah. For me, it's interesting that they're, it's like books that they want to like I'm like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting that they're going back to some sort of like textual basis for civilization, if you want to call it that. But I think so like that's really interesting, but I think it's just generally a kind of political, or like this sort of not even like political, I don't want to like make it sound like it's more important than it is or something, but I think it's this general mood of resignation that I find that is like, okay, well, we're all gonna die, so let's
Yeah, there's this sort of like obsession with fossilizing the present.
Yes.
It's like pastifying for the future what's happening now, and by trying to guess what might be, well, it's not even doing like a process of filtering. It seems like just like we'll put it all down there on this different medium. Yeah.
You said it's funded by the Long Now?
Yeah.
Which makes so much sense to me.
Oh, it makes so much sense. Yeah.
Like the clock, the Rosetta Stone project, like this this necessity to be like forever stewards of the earth. And like,
Stewards.
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 Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like a burial in a way.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking back to like Egyptian burials and being buried with your objects and ancestral rites.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about this earlier today. It feels like throwing a funeral for someone that's still here. That's what mom feels like to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a conference I saw. Well, like it was technically a collaborative fiction project, because it was an invitation of a bunch of different speculative fiction authors, and their work in this project was framed as a conference, like as an academic conference from the future, an archaeological future. So these are archaeologists from the future who are looking back at stuff in the past, which would be our near future of the present. And it was all presented like this, panels and all this stuff as if it were actually happening in real life. It feels similar to this thing of like trying to freeze the present and already like imagine that you're already gone. It seems like a typical thing that happens, especially in like science fiction and stuff too.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. You'll have to tell me more about that.
Yeah. I'll send you a link when I can remember what it is.
Yeah. I think Danielle, did you have a?
I had a question. Okay. I guess now I'm making the connection, so maybe it isn't a question anymore, but I wanted you to speak more about like the strange pedagogy that you're highlighting via Hayek. And I'm just thinking like the strange pedagogy of like the markets, because that's not something I would necessarily apply to like classic economic or classical economic theory. I think more like behavioral work, but maybe that's the connection you're making that I just can find right away to like the MOM project, which is, it's like, it's a pedagogy through a humanities kind of approach. I don't, but can you say a little bit more about what's the role of the pedagogy in this?
Yeah, so that is something that I am very interested in a very loose way, but I sort of haven't fleshed out. But it really came to me when I was reading Contingent Computation, the Beatrice Fozzi book, because she specifically talks about this term that means formation and is also used in terms of thinking about, this is sort of the birth of this sort of bourgeois subjectivity in Europe. And I think you have a very interesting way in which that a lot of those kind of constitutive contradictions that you see in European thinking during that time play out in both in terms of thinking about markets, where markets are where basically everyone is a sort of autodidact, while also being very, very structurally sort of determined. And you have these contradictions that are, play out in weird ways in which sort of technocrats, avoid sort of like stand behind democracy to make sure it's functioning in Hayek and things like that. And I think you also have a lot of conversation about machine learning that's sort of also caught in this sort of constitutive contradiction where, at this point, on the one hand, you have like, so much hype where, you think that like ChatGPT is like an autodidact, for example, which is like totally makes sense here in the Valley because, you have this like mythology of dropping out and everyone's sort of like doing things on their own. So I think you have this really reflecting, a kind of like pedagogy of machine learning that's like really bad pedagogy. But that's something that I would be like really, really fascinated in actually looking into more, but it's just something that kind of came out of basically me reading a book one day. But yeah, that is something that I'm really interested in, and that's my answer to your question. Yeah. But if you have any more, other thoughts, I would be really, really interested in hearing about that.
I think in that nihilistic quote about the art fossil, it says like, we can find the art fossil if we know like the radioactive decay of such and such when we look back and see. Is there any utility in this project to thinking about that, like a kind of short circuit that happens the other way, where like in the example of pulsars and stuff that we look, those then serve as the kind of most accurate clock, and then sort of feed into the microtemporality. So like the ancestral archaic quality of these stars that we see then jumps like both metabolic rifts and touches the microtemporal. Would that be of any utility here to think?
No, I think you see that also. I mean, like he's not saying like let's go back to like observable phenomena, motion and rest, like he's relying on, and I guess that also goes back to thinking about like archaeology and paleontology, where like in order to have some sort of like the sort of realism of speculative realism, you need things like carbon dating, and you need like a lot of infrastructure, and you need a lot of media in order to sort of make that happen. And I think he's sort of oddly like there are moments like this quote where he's like oddly aware of that, like he calls that the material substrate, and then there are other moments where I just couldn't care less what he has to say. I don't know if that's like where you're,
I think that aspect is important.
Yeah, and I think this is really helpful for me to sort of think through as I'm figuring out where to go next. Yeah.
Sorry to go back to the moment. Is that, do you see any similarities between this project and the investigations they've done to come up with the nuclear waste markers, to sort of warn the future of this is where we buried this stuff and all the challenges that goes into that. So are we going to communicate with people 10,000 or even 100,000 years in the future, and who are these people, and what languages do they speak, and so on. Are they? Do you know if they've raised similar questions in this project, or are they just, fine with, let's say, resurrecting the Western canon and putting it into the salt mine you mentioned, or how do those compare?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's kind of, it's often very similar people that are worried about these questions. Like, I mean, nuclear disaster, for example, is a huge concern for people talking about existential risk. So I think you really see those conversations in terms of what is actually happening on the level of like, what kind of signage do we put up, and how do we, make it, somehow, how do we create some sort of weird symbolic order that will last through, until, someone comes on, on a spaceship and potentially walks into, uncovers a bunch of nuclear waste or something like that. But I think there's a similar logic where there's much more concern and a lot more energy pushed towards that. And I think that's again, very similar with what happens with AI. And it's often at the expense, and it's also they have a very little, or at least maybe some people have very concrete proposals. And I think nuclear, talking about the signage of nuclear waste is a very concrete proposal. Whereas that actually contrasts sometimes with some of the conversation about AI, where people are just sitting on a calculator talking about how many people are going to be alive over the next 300 years. And what that, and just creating all these weird calculations while not even talking about even a thing as simple as open source. So I think the conversation there is actually, as far as I can tell, even actually a little bit more advanced and a little bit more down to earth, because it's not just it's a very particular problem that also is something that we're facing today in a kind of real world policy way. But it's often the same people, as far as I can tell.
Do you know that movie Containment that Gallison's worked on? Yeah, it's about that. It's about signage, but I would say take a look at it because it's really about communication and mediation, both across millennia, across cultures, but also immediately. So there's a lot of discussion about towns that are affected by the waste, right? And so these community discussions about how are we going to deal with this and who's putting it on us, but then with this long-term mediation horizon. It's really worth looking at as a document in itself, I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of this reading, the gesture to read Marx after Kant, in the way that I'm seeing it now, in the Kant in the Third Critique, and the connection to Hayek through Mach. Is it that, because what I see then, and the interesting connection to neural networks, thinking of the market kind of functioning as this irreducible to one agent, is it then to, through Milieu say that what the metabolic riff would suggest is to not forget the material substrate, but then I'm confused what the link to Kant is, because what I think of this, the way that you presented Kant, I think of Hayek makes sense that you would read it that way, and then would read the market as an extension of this kind of organism or genius kind of manifesting, nature manifesting through the individual, and then the market, and then neural network computing being an extension of this, this is how nature plays out as an organism. So what is the kind of the move to read Marx more effectively through Kant that you're making?
Yeah, so the move would be, so it's for me, the connection is still kind of crystallizing, but I think there's a general, there's a kind of vitalist approach to nature in the world that seems to come at the expense of any sense of sort of material constraints that would be accompanied by the geological. And in Hayek, I think I'm in that kind of moment, I'm still getting there. Because I think you have that much more playing out much more in like second order systems theory and things like Luhmann, where he talks about, okay, if this system environment distinction is only system internal, then we do have like an environmental problem. Like, you know, and he like finally figures that out in the 90s, that like, you know, the system is eventually, you know, sort of like colonizes the planet. But in terms of, but I think kind of what I'm trying to do is say that that logic, or like look at how that logic might already be there. But that is just kind of work that I'm trying to figure. Like, if you have any recommendations there, that would be great. But that was kind of the Kant through Hayek line that I was looking at. But I can't show you something that's not there. I can't, you know, like, oh, Hayek doesn't talk about geology. Like, let me show you how he doesn't talk about geology. But that's kind of something that I'm trying to think about. I don't know if that means like taking a deep dive into the like Dartmouth conference papers and it's like really like following up there or what. But that's something that I kind of have to see.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But that's sort of where I see the thread and where I am kind of trying to pull at the thread. Yeah. Pauline?
Yeah, I have a question. I was just looking at like statistical probability and things, maybe more like life insurance or even like different like home insurances against climate change disasters and things like that, because I feel like that might be in a similar way of looking at the large amount of data, but more in the short term, or like more specified times, basically. That's relevant or something you can do.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting because that kind of conversation, I think, is where long-termists sort of start. They're like, oh, we're way more worried about insuring our beach houses in Florida or something like that than we are about these big issues. But then everything after that is like, what the fuck happens? That's my like long-termism 101. As far as I can tell. But so I think that's kind of the pushing off point for some of these conversations, to look beyond you know, something that would be insurable within, you know, a human lifetime. Questions like that. But it would be interesting to see if there were, you know, a much more direct conversation between some of these elements. But I really don't. Nothing comes off. Yeah, there's really nothing off the top of my head. I think because that would be much more associated. I think that would be where the so that's sort of where the microtemporal logic thinking about computation and financialization meets the meso, and then, you know, you have at least some people saying, oh, that's not enough, we need to think about the macro. But I guess that's also the sort of impetus for this paper, was that doesn't necessarily speak to the macro, and we can't speak of the macro in the same utilitarian terms that we would think about in terms of, you know, insuring a house or something like that. Is that clear at all? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to draw out a bit more about the arc fossil in terms of like static versus movement, because I was thinking about the two examples you give of like stars and also isotopes, where the way that we're able to gain information from them is by the fact that they're changing, that the isotope, the radioactive, like it's like being depleted, or the pulsar is like emitting this electromagnetic waves, and that's how we get this information. And it's interesting then going to the art pieces that you were looking at, where you have with Mom this concern coming from the technological community that's working with AI, which itself is constantly changing, and the only way they are able to preserve that information is by making it static and freezing that information basically in these tablets. And even in the second one, Future Fossil Spaces, where it is made with these minerals that aren't really going to change. And I was curious, just like if you see, I know you said, at least Mom, like you don't really think of it, you don't see it as like this completely great example because it doesn't really work
temporally, but then I'm also curious, like, how you would see these art pieces in relation to their fossil in terms of change, like kinetic versus static movement. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's really, really interesting. Thinking about Okay, so that's really interesting thinking about kinetic energy, because that really came out. I mean, I think thinking in terms of kinetic energy is really important because that was something that was kind of looming under, or sort of like creeping up to the surface in the early 18th century when people were were like theorizing life, basically. And there were these whole series of debates about closed mechanical systems between Leibniz and Cartesian philosophers in France, basically theorizing life in terms of kinetic energy. So I think you have this this sort of thinking constantly in terms of motion and rest, and you have the you have the perpetual motion machine, and Marx describing the logic of capital as well. So I think really thinking in these terms is really interesting, and it's interesting to see also how these terms change over time. Where that leaves us in terms of thinking about minerality and these examples, I mean, I think at the end of the day, there's something like very relational about motion and static too that I think is playing out in especially in the Sharia. It's almost like a sort of duck rabbit picture. What do you call those? Where you like see two pictures at once? Yeah, where you like see two pictures, and I think you can see it at rest, or you can see it, really, really in dynamic motion. And I think that at least what strikes me about that work is that you really see, whereas you don't only see, for example, salt as sort of potential, or lithium brine as a sort of potential energy source, something like that. You're seeing it actuated in its current form and taking on a much more sort of active role and a much more visible role as well in these pieces. So yeah, I don't know if that really is what you're aiming at, but
Seeing it as both is, especially for the
this is really helping me kind of see what's next.
Can I just clarify, and sorry if forcing you to repeat yourself, like where exactly you see the dividing line between like mesotemporal and microtemporal on one side, macrotemporal on the other, like how we're kind of demarcating that?
Good question. So the micro and the meso, the kind of go-to is always the 10th of the second measurement. That was sort of coming out of actually astrophysics, studying the reaction time of, I can't remember who it was, but it was like someone basically finding the mean of delay in his like these groups of like grad students basically that were like writing star charts in like mid-19th century, and found out that like the average delay time was a 10th of a second in the sort of human sensorium, and then that also became a means for measuring performance because you would want assistants or people that could react faster. And I mean that's also been used by like Bernard Stiegler in thinking about the sort of boundary, the temporal boundary between computation and human cognition. I don't know if I would want to really like Stiegler is basically like sort of like boring humanist couched in like really sexy French theoretical English. I think like at the end of the day, I think he like what he has to say is great and important, but I think that's sort of like where he goes. I don't know how far I would want to go in terms of like essentializing the mesoscopic, but that's sort of something that I think is an important part of the conversation. In terms of where the macro and the meso, I think that gets a little bit more messy because like, do you say that the mesoscopic is like when I die or when everybody in this room is like no longer here, or does it mean like 200 years? I think that's something that is a little bit less clear in terms of where so I don't know if I would want to like quantify the mesoscopic, but like we're not thinking in terms of ARs. So yeah, I don't know if we want to like work our way down from there, but like centuries, not aeons. I don't know if I would want to like go higher. what, is that helpful at all?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's kind of funny because the Mother Mom project like is, some of the long-termists in general, right? Some of the, to the extent that there's a folly, right, which I definitely think there is, you can think that it's like they're thinking on the wrong time scale, but also like they're abstracting themselves in certain ways. They're conceiving like the human species in particular, like there's lots of different ways to look at that folly in this kind of like meso versus macro. Obviously, that's not like contradicting anything you're saying, but this meso versus macro seems like only part of it, and it's kind of a tricky one because as soon as you go to any kind of like systems level thinking and thinking about policy in general, right? You kind of immediately assigning some sort of macro scale, like ish, right? And you figure there's like this probability function of catastrophe over X thousand years, or it could happen 20 years from now. The ideal generous reading of the long-termist position, I guess, is there's that continuous transition from it could happen tomorrow to it could happen 2,000 years from now. I mean, obviously, it seems like they're mostly living in 2,000 years from now, and not like 200 or 150 years from now. But yeah, I guess I'm just kind of interested thinking to what extent their folly is really like their time span, or is it almost like the time span of thinking of this not even really where their problems arising, right?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily see it as I mean, I think this is where what I'm attempting gets tricky because this time span isn't necessarily like, okay, maybe they're talking about like 300 years is probably like around where most people are comfortable, like in these circles, as far as I see it, are kind of interested in talking about, which is fine. But what I think is there's a general kind of like, it's unclear why that folds into the mesoscopic in a very particular way, where you have, like talking about civilization as this big progress narrative, etc. So I think it's unclear how that happens. But then the problem, I think, or the sort of like challenge though with producing an alternative, especially one that's based off of mesoscopic, is not generalizing that as some sort of like essentializing humanism, where you're like, okay, let's just like, yeah, I don't even know what that would look like, but I think that's sort of where you, why people tend not to want to approach the mesoscopic, I think, outside of certain circles, like long-termism. I don't know, we should talk more though. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. Yeah, okay.
Well, I'm thinking about the question earlier too, about the oscillations between the animated and the static. And I guess I'm also thinking about the role of decay, perhaps, in your research. So yeah, if you could just possibly talk about that, if it's relevant at all, in this discussion of archaefossil and discussions of the biological, the geological, and I guess and the metabolic, I suppose.
Yeah, so crystallization, rock crystallization, I think, is a really interesting process here because, like, if you take like salt crystals, for example, in terms of thinking about time, it's actually a reversible process. So I think that actually is a fascinating kind of substrate or a way of thinking. I got
like in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
When they find the mosquito in the amber.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where this actually becomes a much different conversation than like less universalized thermodynamics, for example. I don't know. I'm like, yeah. So this is like the intersection of a lot of like odd interests that I'm like curating at the moment. But yeah. So I think that's what I would have to, or like where I would look for thinking about like temporality, reversibility, thinking about decay. There's something about like, there's this sort of difference in terms of, I don't know, like it sort of pushes boundaries of like the geological, or especially crystallization, like mineral crystallization sort of pushes the boundaries of how we think about time in these processes, both in terms of like thinking about the temporality of information systems, thinking about the temporality of biological organisms, etc. Yeah. This is all very broad, but that's like, that for me is something that I would really stress if I had to sort of, if I were to go in that direction or like say something about that. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Totally different topic, but I appreciated you bringing in the part, and I'm just thinking a lot about like land art and monuments, like maybe associated with decay. I'm just thinking of like the Michael Heiser, like building a city, you know, for like whatever 50 years, and like these works that almost like live beyond the lifespan themselves, and how they affect and extract from resources. But losing my, oh, I guess like a larger question is like, what is the importance to you of bringing in art in this project? Because I can like associate with what you're saying to different artworks, but I don't know their purpose in terms of like what they're doing for you. And it makes me think about the Mom project. Like, why do they brand it as art? I mean, that seems pretty critical to its kind of, I don't know, funding, perhaps. Like, so what, yeah, what's happening there? Like, just interesting.
I think that art is the quickest way of sort of getting the mesoscopic back into the conversation, I think, and also thinking in terms of like sensing and embodied sensing that the mesoscopic and its kind of messiness requires. And I think that's also why Mom, for me, is like slightly different, or kind of is, maybe it's a bit extreme to call it a counterexample, but there's something it seems like qualitatively different between sort of an installation that you can go and experience, and me having to write Martin Kuntz an email and then having to fix the funicular so we can go down to the world's oldest salt mine in Austria, and sort of just like see whatever it is they actually have done, which it doesn't actually, it's unclear how much they have actually collected. And I mean, it would be amazing if they just had like loads of shit just like ready to go, but I'm not convinced that's the case. Again, they can't go down because the funicular is broken. Anyway, so I think that's where art really like, and I know it sounds like, and I hope that I will find more to say about art, because I don't want to just use the art to make a point, but that to me also is a point about the importance of sort of art in this, as this sort of mediating, and as doing this work of scaling. Yeah, does that help at all? Okay.
I mean, I guess there's like a tension between art and artifact that's happening here.
Can you say more?
Like artifact being like something that is already, or having artifacts already within the Mom installation or something along those lines.
Your earlier suggestion that it was like Egyptian burial rites.
Yeah.
Or the way that like clay tablets now are like history textbooks.
In archaeology versus the
Yeah. Yeah. Also, how it gets buried. Like, there's a difference between like, the like, just like time doing its thing, and like, oh, let's bury this shit so no one finds it for like 100,000 years. I don't know. I'm sure the project's fascinating. I just find it so cool in a really weird way. So I don't mean to like constantly be bashing what we've agreed now to call Mom.
I just had to, when you were talking about the salt mine, I just had to think of, I lived in Poland for a year, and there's a salt mine called Geological in southern Poland. Have you been there?
No, but that is also on my
trip.
Yeah.
There's a cathedral. Like, I mean, basically, right? So like there's these chandeliers and these statues all made out of salt, right? And then, I mean, this salt mine, it operated from like the 13th century. I mean, it's basically what Poland's monarchy like founded itself on, right? Until like the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
I was there just a couple of years after it closed, basically, right? But now it's like this cultural preservation site in a way, right? It preserves and transmits to the future like this idea of like the kind of history of Polish monarchy and Catholicism, and like also these like what do you call them, like I don't know, like there's these kind of fairy type beings and whatnot that are rooted in like the local mythology and whatnot. So I'm just wondering about something like this, which is very much, I would say, you know, a conscious attempt to like be a part of history, right? To something that is like basically projecting beyond human history.
Yeah, I mean, like, that mine is like holy shit. There's sculptors that there's sculptures that the miners just made on their free time. I mean, you want to like I want to talk about geological kind of and like sort of like mesoscopic labor. That's like right there.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, that's like also going to be a big destination on my salt-based tour of Central Europe.
Salt tour.
I'm having a salt tour. Yeah.
Is there like a,
Just actually some things that jogged a connection to the history of containment in America, where Native Americans were basically taken out of history while they were still like in the 19th century, when they were still there. I mean, they are still here too, but like they were written out as if they were past dead civilizations, and that allowed American colonizers to really move in and take over. And it connects actually with maybe what even you said earlier, someone on the side of the room, I think, about how this MOM project was a way of memorializing ourselves now as if we had already passed. So like freezing the present and this idea of stability versus, or the static versus the dynamic. This would be in a very different way, a very positive take on it, where you want to immortalize yourself rather than in a very negative, I don't know, just because there is an existing term in scholarship around this kind of concept called containment. That's potentially useful as a contrast, even though it's very different.
I think that is, and I mean, yeah, I mean, Native American studies is like extremely sensitive, but I think also quite good at talking about extinction. I mean, there's this Martin Cruson co-edited volume on extinction with a really, really good entry that's basically saying like if you want to talk to someone with experience with extinction, like come talk to us. And I think that,
right?
Yeah. Did I say Robert?
Oh, you said Martin.
Oh, Martin. What? Yeah.
After extinction. Yeah, that's a good
After Extinction is the name of the volume. And I think I'm much more sympathetic to that. And it's not like they were like, oh, we're gonna like go extinct one day. Let's like memorialize ourselves. And then and then suddenly, there was this like imperialist conquest. So so I think that's something that I'm generally sort of sympathetic to, and I think it's just like interesting to think about.
Even with burial mounds, I mean, these might be purely superficial connections, and I see your project is very different, but just to have maybe floating in orbit.
Yeah. Burial mounds also really helpful.
But I think they're not superficial connections.
No.
Especially with like the Stiglerian horizon that you're working with. I mean, these are tertiary retentions in a way, right? But on a large scale, not on the scale of, the way that this is a tertiary retention of whatever, right? But on the scale that like transcends the permanence or the imagined permanence of a society, right?
And Vantor.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's something as like to the like to the like Bazan sort of spiel about all art being, about sort of self-memorialization and sort of thinking about that. So I think that's there in all of these projects, but it's more just like, okay, if you sort of zoom in or take that just like to one, like if you sort of just look a little bit deeper than that, then what kind of distinctions rise and how this process occurs. That's sort of the part that's interesting. That's really interesting to me. You had
yeah, I was just gonna say there seems to be like a weird contradiction between this like desire, like long-termist desire to want to memorialize the materiality of today for the future, and the effacement of like the material substrate that's creating like the mesoscopic conditions of today, right? So we want to preserve now for future generations to see the beauty of our life today, but the effacement of the current material substrate that allows that kind of world to exist in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, also somehow praising how we got here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, like what we owe the future is all about how like, oh, things are great now because we don't have slavery anymore. Like that's the whole premise of like the calculations about the future. Yeah, I don't know. I love hate reading this shit. It's really bizarre, but yeah, I mean, we should talk more because it sounds like, I mean, I know there are, you know, much more sympathetic ways of understanding this than I'm presenting, but yeah, I was just like really struck by the contrast of these two examples. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I think, you know, on this topic, I think there's, you know, we might benefit from looking into some of the, let's say, heritage studies. That's sort of, you know, what I think that's part of what we're talking about here, and the I guess the violence, if you will, that comes with always preserving something. You have to you want to keep it. Of course, it can't be kept anyway. And if you're able for some reason to preserve it, it's not going to be able to be preserved in the state that it once was. And you know, if you look at someone like Susan Weo's, you know, thinking in the 1950s about, you know, the problem with the antelope, it's outrunning, it's part of the species when it's out in the savannah. When you bring it into the park, it becomes what she calls a document, right? So you have to kill it if you want to keep it in this state where you can observe it and study it. It's, you know, sorry, I have to kill it, and this is the only way we can. And so that's an interesting idea. I think that sort of touches on the problem of death and so on. And you have people now in preservation studies that will say, you know, we have to rethink preservation and to also have it include, you know, things like decay. So we have to, I guess, embrace the notion of decay also in preservation studies. So those fields are becoming acute to these problems that we're touching upon.
It's a nice connection to metabolic rift also.
I'm sorry?
It's a nice connection to metabolic rift.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think that's also where, again, you see this sort of static motion, sort of like Kippenbill, this sort of like dual figure of like, you know, either a duck or a rabbit or, you know, whatever example you want to use, where it is really just like, it's not as banal as like one person's survival is another person's extinction, but it also very fundamentally is, like in the, you know, for example, like genocide in North America. So, and I think that's generally what I'm suspicious about about long-termism, is that that's not how it's presented. It's sort of like, well, okay, look at the numbers, you know, like X number of, you know, Palestinians, for example, like, you know, maybe they won't be around any longer, but like, you know, our species is going to, you know, be, you know, like there's so much more, there's so many, you know, the numbers are bigger elsewhere. So yeah. So I think it's really that, yeah, besides like between preservation and decay, there's a lot of, yeah, I think there's a lot of like gray area and yeah, sort of questions about how reversible these processes are, yeah, how we're perceiving them also. So I think that's also, yeah, like really, really interesting and something that I think also is evoked by Xiaohe's artwork too. I mean, like he does shit like he'll climb like, I don't know if I imagine, you know, many of you went to the SF MoMA, but there are like pictures of him like climbing glaciers, with like a torch and just like torching glaciers and stuff like that, and kind of like asking questions in a very provocative way. Yeah. So yeah, I agree.
I have a couple of different points that are attached onto other people's things that I think may be useful. I think one, to thinking about the natural, like thinking about Indigenous representation, I think the Museum of Natural History in New York just actually closed their Indigenous exhibitions, or maybe it was at the Smithsonian or something. One of these museums of natural history have have closed like,
I
entirely,
think
yeah.
a lot, right?
Yeah,
They
yeah,
put up
until they get like
curtains and
consent.
stuff, right?
I think they renovated a section and then they actually just redid the diagram where they have like critical, like they have their prior displays with critical like sections of below, so it's like.
Oh, really?
I think what you're talking about is, yeah, there's a new like guideline that a lot of museums have agreed on, that they have to consult the native people to ask if this is okay to represent it that way. And so a lot of them are right now still consulting and they put up curtains. Yeah.
So I guess if that's thinking about reversibility or something. I think also thinking about like embalming, maybe that's a keyword that we're like struggling with. And also with that, thinking about ritual, thinking about cathedrals and these salt mines and whatnot and burial and so on versus like being preserved or fossilized over time. And then the last thing is there's this movie that just came out called Love Me. It premiered at Sundance and it's probably gonna get popular circulation like very soon. It features Kristen Stewart and Steven Yeun, and basically they're voicing like these two. It's really funny because the whole movie advertises that it's like, oh look at these two stars, when they don't show up until like 40 minutes later, and most of it's just like their CGI avatars, because it's like a Wall-E story of like satellite falling in love with like a bot or with like a what's it called, like a thing that bobs up and down in the ocean, a buoy, yeah, but it's like a smart buoy. And they're both like, how can we become more human? And so they access the internet. They look at these YouTube videos of these influencers, and then over the time scale of like that extinction of mankind until like 4 billion years later, whenever like the sun blows up, they like have to figure out what it means to be human, like by looking at this huge, massive archaeology of people preserving themselves on the internet, which through influencer culture. But anyway, it might be of interest to you. It seems like maybe it could be a funny thing to add on to like the whole Mom project as like a post. Maybe this is what the afterlife. Yeah, after Mom. This is what we were.
That sounds
But
amazing.
anyway, yeah, it's called Love. Yeah, Kristen Stewart and Steven Yeun. Yeah.
That sounds very similar to this Lawrence Leck video that they
Oh,
showed.
yeah. Yeah, Lawrence
the
Leck, yeah.
Mars and stuff.
Yeah, the Xenofuturism trilogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't.
Yeah, I'm just also like underscore the indigenous studies. I think it would be really wonderful to bring into your project because this whole like what we're talking about in terms of preservation, I think we just can get way more expansive in generational times, not existing in the same way. So it's not about an object, you know. But the idea of like that it becomes a document and like how things get archived, I almost think like the whole idea or study of just like metadata and data and like classification would be interesting with this project too. It's not my specificity or whatever, but in performance studies, in puppetry studies rather, there's like a whole discussion about how puppets get preserved and like how they get classified, and that kind of ties into the dynamics versus the static object, and also this idea of the like and how we see ourselves. So that's all. I went to that salt mine, and it's so incredible that it's like all these like human sculptures. It's not just like abstract forms, like actually making the like the self or something into salt. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that would be something, just sort of looking at how that the classification of data would be something that I would be very interested in doing. I think it's very hard to do well, but I think there is some really important work that's going on there. Like Yakwe, probably his first book is probably the one that, like, there's a very brief part where he talks about like I think it was like a W3 development conference, and there were these like Japanese coders that were like, "You're telling us that we need to like arrange these files like in these like family tree folders, but like we literally have no language, or like we don't have one word for aunt or uncle, so like we literally can't code in our language." So that's the closest that I've seen where this sort of like return of the meso in the micro on kind of that level, but that would be something that I like really would need to, yeah, it's like, yeah, quite literally beyond my pay scale in a lot of ways. But I think that would be something to, yeah, to really like look into. Yeah, because there's also a kind of way in which the micro is sort of like taken out of itself. You know, like sort of forced to confront that it's not this like, you know, sort of like mysterious subatomic thing. It's also something that's like very much in conversation with the world that we have. Yeah.
Questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Bryan, for everything.